We did that again, did we not, Mark? After the tech stock bubble of the 90s. In fact, I recall that the key phrase there then in the 90s was we're in a new paradigm. That was the phrase, new paradigm of, the stock market would always go up, and then when it went down, uh, did not the Fed intervene to try to prop everything up again?
Oh yeah, it's just another cycle, another terrible cycle. The 1990s, were the tech stock bubble. It was also supposed to be a new era, a new paradigm, where technology was simply going to outrun any problem that might develop in the economy. And that, to a certain extent, that's true. I mean, we do depend upon technological advances to overcome obstacles in the natural economy, but this was something other than that. This is, they were saying technology is going to simply put everybody out of work, and the only thing we're going to have to worry about is not production and consumption and distribution, but simply having enough to do on a regular basis. And so, it's that kind of nonsense that creeps into the discourse in terms of the economy. And then, of course, we had the tech stock meltdown, the NASDAQ falling by an incredible percentage, and many, many companies simply going out of existence. And the correction was actually, taking a fine shape. I mean, the economy was adjusting very well to the bus because all of these tech companies, fortunately, were hard to, monitor for the government. They weren't heavily regulated, and so they very often went out of business just as quickly as they went into business. But then the government got into the business of trying to bail out the situation, of trying to enforce government remedies on the situation. And, they reduced, the Federal Reserve reduced interest rates from a normal range of around 6% down to 1%. And they kept interest rates very low, nothing along the lines of what the market would be charging. And as a result, they ended up, of course, starting the housing bubble, which, incidentally, we went back and looked at Paul Krugman's columns in the New York Times for 2001 and 2002. And on several occasions in these published columns, he actually called for the Federal Reserve to reduce interest rates, to get them lower than they'd ever been before, specifically to generate a housing bubble which would take the place of the tech bubble, which had broken down. And so there you have Paul Krugman specifically requesting that the central bank, the Federal Reserve, lower interest rates in order to create a housing bubble. Thank you
Mark,
very much.
I just have a personal anecdote about Paul Krugman. He was here at the University of Iowa last year, just about, spring of '09. He was welcomed, as the great Nobel Prize winner. And he gave a talk in which he called for another bubble. And what was fascinating about it was he actually stated that the previous crisis, or the current crisis, was caused by easy money policy, but yet we should ignore all that, and we should have easy money policy again, because the important thing was just get the economy roaring again at whatever cost. And just one more little anecdote. There were several questions from the audience that took him to task for that. In fact, these were all people who gave him, standing applause when he came in, and yet they all said, well, we don't quite, could you explain, you said that this crisis was caused by easy money, but yet we should still keep easy money. And he just hemmed and hawed, had no answer for them. So,
well, he doesn't. He doesn't have any answer. It's just, he's going back to basic Keynesian, the basic Keynesian toolbook. And it's a very mechanical view of the economy where you can just, pour water in one end and it comes out the other. With all disregard to the real workings of the economy in terms of how companies are run and, what they require and what they're based on, and how entrepreneurs actually function. And so, you really need to see him to believe him, because he looks crazy. And then once you see him, you realize that his economics is basically nonsense as well. the idea of calling for, and it's what the Austrians emphasize, is that the boom is really the problem, that when the Federal Reserve subsidizes the interest rate in effect, you're taking resources away from areas of the economy where they're productive and actually serving consumer needs, and you're putting them into bubble activities which are unproductive and which will ultimately be seen as malinvestments or bad investments that really don't serve the consumers in terms of their most vital and most desired needs. And Krugman just has no sense of that. He just believes you can just pump up one thing and it will rev up another, and we can get GDP up to a certain level. And he really thinks in this way, whereas if you can add dollars into one end, that you'll pump up that GDP statistic no matter what the number actually represents.
Yeah, I think in your talk at the Mises Institute, you had a very humorous just talk about what an economist named Tyler Cowen had to say about the Austrian business cycle theory. I wondered if in the few minutes we have remaining in this segment, if you could just go over that. It was very funny.
Yeah, Tyler Cowen is an important economist that works at George Mason University. He's somebody who knows or knew of Austrian economics because he learned it from Austrian economists, but he's, in a sense, discarded the Austrian view of things. He no longer calls himself an Austrian, but he obviously realizes what it is. And so he put this blog post where he listed, if I were an Austrian economist, I would believe. And then he basically laid out the conditions of the boom-bust cycle where we were basically had interest rates were too low, and that there was too much money in housing, and that asset prices were overvalued, and that pretty soon the whole thing is going to blow up in our face, and that the economy is going to crumble, and that the dollar is going to be in trouble. And he said, at the end of his post, he said, but that's not me. Yeah. And ultimately, all of the stuff that he said in there about predicting about where things are going and why they're being caused in terms of the boom-bust cycle, everything turned out to be almost exactly correct. But
maybe he was looking for a job, some kind of governmental post or something.
Well, George Mason University is right close to Washington, D.C. and
short commute.
Yeah, you can see the heavy influence of Washington, D.C. there. His blog is actually called The Marginal Revolution, which is a thing in the history of economic thought. But I think it really represents what Tyler Cowen and his ilk, with the way they view things, is they don't want to rock the boat, and that they want to hide the Austrian theory of business cycle, that they don't want to get it too close to Washington, D.C., because that's where the Federal Reserve is. And the Austrian theory of the business cycle basically points the finger at the central bank or the Federal Reserve as the cause. And so, he calls it the marginal revolution, which means it's not revolution. It's, just barely revolutionary. We're just trying to make minor improvements about what's going on in Washington, D.C. And, I think that that's a wrong strategy, that if you try to make minor improvements in Washington, D.C., that it's basically going to get worse and worse and worse over time. What we really need is a substantial fundamental revolution in economics and economic policy and in money and banking in this country. And I think that's, become fully obvious now to the American people that we've suffered two very significant bubble boom-bust cycles over the last 10 years.
Okay, so Mark, I'm going to have to interrupt you right now because we are coming into our break. So everyone, stay with us. We'll be right back.